Thomas stood at the edge of the landing platform, watching the red dust of Mars swirl around his boots. The wind was cold even through his thermal suit. He was 62 years old, and for the first time in his life he had nothing to do. Retirement had seemed like a dream when he was younger, but now it felt like a prison. He had spent 40 years fixing machines, solving problems, building things that worked. Without that, he did not know who he was anymore. The auction house had called him 3 days ago. They had something he might like, they said. A ship. An old one. Something from before the wars, before humanity had spread too far across the galaxy. Thomas had not been interested at first. He had enough money. He had a comfortable apartment in the colony. He did not need anything else. But then he went to see it. The ship sat on the landing pad like a sleeping giant. It was massive, easily 300 meters long, with a hull that was scarred and weathered by time and space. The metal was a strange silver-gray color, not quite human technology, not quite anything else. Thomas knew immediately that it was alien. The auction house had not told him that. They probably thought it would lower the price even more than it already was. Thomas had paid almost nothing for it. The seller had been desperate to get rid of it. It had been sitting in the salvage yards for over 50 years. No one wanted it. It was too old, too strange, and too expensive to maintain. For Thomas it was perfect. He had purchased it that day, and now here he was standing in front of his new workshop. Or at least that was what he was telling himself. An old ship, full of metal and wiring and parts he could use for his restoration projects. He had always enjoyed taking old things apart and putting them back together again. This ship would give him years of work. Thomas climbed the boarding ramp. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridor. The air inside was cold and stale. Nothing had moved in this ship for a very long time. Emergency lights flickered on as he walked, responding to his presence. The ship was still alive in some way, still conscious of the world around it. He spent the first week simply walking through the corridors, taking notes, drawing maps of what he found. There was equipment he recognized and equipment he did not. There were rooms filled with strange machines, storage areas full of containers he could not open, and sections of the ship that were sealed off behind walls of unknown metal. In the main control room, Thomas found something interesting. A computer core. It was large and complex, with more systems than any human ship would need. He began to examine it carefully, running his hands over the surface, checking the connections. Most of the power was shut down, but underneath all the dead systems he could feel a very faint hum. Something deep inside the core was still active. Still drawing power after all these years. Thomas became curious. He wanted to know more. He spent hours at the computer terminal, trying to unlock the old systems, trying to understand how they worked. The technology was different from what he knew, but the basic principles were the same. Everything was just information. Everything could be understood if you looked at it from the right angle. On the third day of working on the core, he found it. A hidden partition. It was buried deep within the main processor, hidden behind layers of security that should have been impossible to get through. But Thomas was patient. He worked carefully, testing each lock, each barrier, learning how the alien mind had organized information. It was like learning a new language, but slowly, very slowly, the barriers began to fall away. When the final lock opened, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The file that appeared on the screen was old. Very old. The date marker showed it was from 317 years ago. The text was in a language he should not have been able to read, but the ship's systems translated it automatically into English. Registry code, prisoner transport vessel. Classification level, extreme. Designation, unknown. Containment status, sealed. Condition, unknown. Last recorded activity, 317 years ago. Current status, dormant. Emergency protocols active. Warning, do not approach containment deck 12. Thomas stared at the words on the screen. His hands began to shake. This was not a workshop ship. This was not a storage vessel or a cargo hauler. This was a prison. And something was still inside it. He read more files. The records were fragmentary, broken by time and damage. But he could piece together a story. There was a creature. Something dangerous, something that the old empire had deemed too dangerous to let live but too powerful to simply kill. So they had locked it in this ship in a containment pod in the lowest decks. They had set systems to keep it asleep, to keep it sedated, to keep it imprisoned forever. But that was 317 years ago. The empire that had built this ship was long gone. The systems that kept the creature asleep were powered by reactors that were ancient beyond measure. They would not last forever. Nothing lasted forever. Thomas sat back in the chair and thought about what to do. He could call the authorities. He could tell them what he had found, and they would come and take the ship away and probably destroy it. They would not take any chances with something this old and this unknown. Or he could go down there and see for himself. Thomas knew what he should do. He knew what any sensible person would do. But Thomas had never been very good at being sensible. He had always wanted to understand things, to see how they worked, to know the truth about the mysteries around him. That curiosity had made him a good engineer. It had also gotten him into trouble more times than he could count. He made a decision. Thomas gathered some tools and a portable light source. He marked the location of Containment Deck 12 on his hand-drawn map. Then, before he could change his mind, he began to walk deeper into the ship, toward the lower levels, toward the sleeping thing that had been imprisoned in darkness for over 300 years. Thomas walked down the stairs slowly. The metal beneath his feet was cold, even through his boots. The ship seemed to grow colder as he descended deeper into its interior. The emergency lights that had turned on when he first entered were now fading, as if the ship was slowly losing power the farther down he went. He had to use his portable light to see where he was stepping. The corridors down here were different from the ones above. The walls were thicker. The metal was a different shade, darker somehow, as if it had been painted with something that absorbed light. There were no windows, no portholes. Just solid walls and sealed doors on either side. Thomas knew what this meant. This was the secure section. This was where dangerous things were kept. The hum he had felt in the computer core was much louder down here. It vibrated through the metal, through the walls, through the air itself. Thomas could feel it in his bones, a sound that was almost below the range of human hearing but not quite. It made his teeth ache and his skin prickle with something that might have been fear. He found the observation window without too much difficulty. The map had been accurate even after all these years. The window was enormous, at least 5 meters wide and 3 meters tall, made of thick transparent material that was so strong it could probably withstand a direct hit from a weapon. Thomas pressed his face against the cold glass and looked inside. The containment pod dominated the chamber. It was a massive structure, easily 20 meters long and 10 meters tall, shaped like a capsule or a coffin. The exterior was covered in frost and ice that had accumulated over centuries. Snow clung to every surface, creating patterns that looked almost like crystalline flowers. Inside the frosted glass, Thomas could see something moving. A shape. Something vast and complicated. It was hard to see clearly through all the ice and frost, but Thomas caught glimpses of it as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Tentacles. Long, thick appendages that seemed to move with a life of their own even in sleep. Eyes that were large and dark and somehow intelligent. A body that seemed to twist and turn in ways that human eyes were not quite meant to process. Thomas felt his stomach turn. This thing was real. This thing was alive. And it had been sleeping in this pod for over 300 years. He stood there for a long time just watching. He did not know how long. Maybe minutes. Maybe hours. Time seemed to move differently down here, in the cold and the darkness and the humming silence. Then something changed. The hum got louder. Much louder. It stopped being a sound that was barely at the edge of hearing and became something that filled the entire chamber, that filled Thomas's entire body. He covered his ears, but it did not help. The sound was not really coming from the speakers or the air. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The lights in the corridor flickered and then came on, full brightness, one after another, like a chain reaction running down the length of the ship. Thomas saw them activate in the distance, marching away from him into darkness. The emergency systems were waking up. The ship was waking up. Inside the containment pod, the creature moved. It was not a gentle movement. The frost cracked and fell away from the glass. The shape inside twisted and thrashed. The tentacles that Thomas had seen moving slightly before began to move with purpose, with strength. The creature was waking up. The systems that had kept it asleep for 300 years were failing, and the thing inside the pod was beginning to regain consciousness. Thomas should have run. Every sensible part of him screamed at him to turn around, to run back up the stairs, to get away from this place as fast as his old legs could carry him. But he found that he could not move. He was frozen in place, watching the creature in the pod, watching as its eyes opened wider and wider, watching as it seemed to see him for the first time. For a moment, Thomas and the creature looked at each other through the thick glass of the observation window. Thomas could feel the weight of that gaze, could feel it pressing against him like a physical force. The creature's eyes were ancient and intelligent and terrible. They held the memory of centuries of imprisonment, centuries of darkness and silence and solitude. Then the pod began to fail. The seals that had kept it closed started to disengage with a sound like a great sigh. Hydraulic systems that had been frozen in place for 300 years began to move, groaning with effort, creaking with age. The glass of the pod started to crack, small fissures appearing in the surface, spreading like lightning across the structure. Thomas did move then. He turned and ran. His footsteps echoed through the corridor as he raced back toward the stairs. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the pod continuing to break apart. Metal screaming as it twisted and bent. The sound of locks disengaging. The sound of ancient machinery failing all at once, overwhelmed by the weight of centuries. He reached the stairs and took them two at a time, his old body moving faster than it had in years. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Behind him, he could hear the sound of something massive moving through the corridors of the ship. Not moving quickly, not moving with urgency, but moving with a terrible, inevitable purpose. Thomas did not look back. He did not want to see what was behind him. He just ran up and up, through corridor after corridor, past sealed doors and frozen systems and the slowly brightening emergency lights that marked his path. He reached the upper levels and kept running. He did not stop until he was back in the main control room, the room with the computer core and the hidden files and the history of this terrible ship. He stood there, breathing hard, his lungs burning, his legs shaking from exertion. The ship was quiet again. The hum had stopped. The emergency lights had stabilized. Everything was still. Thomas waited. He did not know what he was waiting for. He only knew that something had changed. The creature in the pod was awake now. The seal had been broken. Whatever ancient imprisonment had kept it contained for 300 years was now at an end. And somewhere in the depths of the ship, in the darkness below, something was moving through the corridors. Something vast and powerful and conscious. Something that had been alone in the darkness for so long that it probably could not remember what the outside world looked like. Thomas sat down slowly in the control room chair and waited to see what would happen next. Thomas sat in the control room chair listening to the silence. His heart had stopped racing, but his hands still trembled. He did not know how long he had been sitting there. Minutes? Hours? Time felt strange in this old ship, as if the normal rules of the world did not apply here. He had expected something to happen. He had expected the creature to come thundering through the corridors, to smash through walls and doors, to hunt him down and destroy him. But nothing had happened. The ship remained silent and still, as if nothing at all had changed. Then the neural interface came to life. The main computer screen flickered once, twice, and then text began to appear. Not in the old alien language this time, but in English. Simple English, translated by the ship's ancient systems. The words appeared slowly, letter by letter, as if something was learning how to communicate for the first time in centuries. Human. You are here. Why? Thomas stared at the screen. His mouth went dry. The creature could communicate. Could think. It could ask questions. He had not expected that. Somehow, he had imagined it as a simple animal, a beast of instinct and hunger. But this was something different. This was something intelligent. Thomas leaned forward slowly and began to type on the keyboard. His fingers were shaky, but he managed to form words. I did not mean to wake you. I was exploring the ship. I found your containment records. The screen went blank for several seconds. Thomas wondered if the connection had been lost. Then new words appeared. How long? Thomas typed the answer. 317 years. Another long pause. The screen flickered several times. Thomas could almost hear the creature thinking, processing this information, trying to understand what it meant. 300 years. More than 300 years asleep. The war? The creature asked. What war? Thomas typed back. My people. The Empire. The Hunters. Thomas thought about the fragmented records he had found in the computer core. He did not have all the answers, but he knew enough to give a partial truth. The Empire is gone. Your people. I do not have complete information about your people. I am sorry. The screen went blank again. This time the pause was even longer. Thomas began to worry that the connection had been lost permanently. He reached out toward the keyboard, wondering if he should try to re-establish contact, when new words appeared. I am alone then. It was not a question. It was a statement. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He could hear the loneliness in those 4 words, the weight of understanding that centuries of imprisonment meant the complete destruction of everything the creature had ever known. I am sorry, Thomas typed. What is your name? How should I address you? The response came quickly this time. I do not remember. The sleep took many things. Memories. Identity. Tom. I am only what remains. I am only this. Thomas sat back and thought about that. The creature had been asleep so long that it had lost even its own name. Centuries of being locked in darkness had erased parts of itself. It was awake now, but it was also broken in ways that Thomas could not fully understand. My name is Thomas, he typed. I am human. I am from Earth. That planet is very far from here. Earth? the creature asked. My home world. Humans came from there long ago. We have spread across many worlds now. Mars is where we are now. This is where your ship has been resting. Thomas waited for a response, but the screen remained blank. He wondered if he had said something wrong, something that had confused or upset the creature further. He was about to type something else when the screen filled with text. Not just a few words this time. Pages of text. Symbols and diagrams and information. The creature was sending him data, images from its memory, fragments of its history. Thomas could see star charts, pictures of worlds he did not recognize, and scenes of violence that made him wince even looking at them. The creature was showing him what had happened. Not just to itself but to its entire species. A civilization that had been hunted down, systematically destroyed, reduced to nothing by a vast empire that had decided its people were a threat. The creature before him was one of the last survivors, imprisoned not because it had done anything wrong, but simply because it existed. Thomas read through the information slowly, trying to understand. The violence was terrible. The cruelty was enormous. But what struck him most was not the violence itself. It was the senselessness of it. These beings had not threatened anyone. They had not invaded anyone's territory. They had simply been different, and that difference had been enough to condemn them all to death or imprisonment. When Thomas had finished reading, he typed a single word. Why? The response came quickly. Because we were strong. Because we were different. Because the Empire was afraid. Thomas thought about that. Fear. It always came down to fear, did it not? The fear of the unknown, the fear of the powerful, the fear of anything that was not the same as oneself. He had seen that fear in human history as well. It had driven wars and cruelty and suffering throughout the ages. I am afraid of you, Thomas typed honestly. But not for the reasons the Empire was afraid. I am afraid because I do not understand. I am afraid because you could hurt me easily if you wanted to. But I am also. I want to understand. I want to know who you are. The screen was silent for a very long time. No one has ever wanted to know who I am, the creature finally typed. They have only ever wanted to know what I am. They have only ever feared what I could do. Then let me be different, Thomas typed. Let me learn who you are. Let me help you if I can. Another pause. Shorter this time. Why would you help me? I am your enemy. You are not my enemy, Thomas typed. You are a survivor. Like me. We are both survivors. We are both alone. Maybe we do not have to be alone anymore. The screen flickered once more, and then a simple message appeared. My name is Oliver. It is what the young ones called me long ago. Before the war. Before everything. Thomas smiled despite his fear. It is good to meet you, Oliver. I am glad you are awake. Thomas began to spend all his time in the control room. He stopped leaving the ship to visit the colony. He stopped eating regular meals. He simply sat at the terminal, talking to Oliver, learning about the creature that had been imprisoned for 300 years in the darkness below the ship. The first thing Oliver asked for was knowledge. Not freedom, not food, not revenge. Knowledge. It wanted to understand what had happened to the universe in the time it had been asleep. Thomas downloaded everything he could find. History files. Scientific papers. Art and music and literature from human civilization. He sent it all to Oliver through the neural interface, and the creature consumed it with a hunger that Thomas had never seen before. Days passed. Thomas slept in the control room chair, eating protein bars and drinking cold water. His appearance grew ragged. His hair became matted. His clothes became dirty. But he did not care. For the first time in years he felt like he had a purpose again. He was not just fixing machines anymore. He was helping something understand the world. On the 7th day, Oliver asked a question that changed everything. Will you come and meet me? Thomas's hand froze over the keyboard. Meet Oliver. Go down to the lower decks. Stand face to face with the creature that had been locked away in the darkness. His first instinct was to refuse. His instinct was to stay safe, to stay in the light, to keep the distance between himself and the unknown. But he thought about what Oliver had said. About having no one. About being alone in the darkness. About being feared and hunted and imprisoned simply for existing. Thomas could not leave it alone anymore. Yes, he typed. I will come and meet you. Thomas gathered supplies. A light source. A communication device so he could stay in contact with Oliver. He brought water and some nutrition packets, though he did not know if Oliver could eat human food. He did not know much of anything about what Oliver needed, but he was determined to try. The descent to the lower decks felt different this time. Thomas was not running in fear. He was walking slowly, deliberately, with purpose. The corridors seemed less threatening now, though the air was still cold and the hum of the ship's system still vibrated through everything. He reached the observation window again. The containment pod was broken open now, the glass shattered, the metal twisted and bent. Inside the chamber, Oliver moved slowly through the darkness. The creature was enormous, even larger than Thomas had imagined when he was looking through the frosted glass. The tentacles were thick as tree trunks and covered in what looked like scales or armor. The eyes were intelligent and sad and very, very old. When Oliver saw Thomas through the window, it stopped moving. The creature turned its entire body to face him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Oliver approached the glass. "You came," Oliver's voice said through a speaker in the observation chamber. It was not the voice of the computer anymore. It was Oliver's own voice, strange and musical and somehow beautiful despite the alien nature of it. "You actually came." "I said I would," Thomas replied, his voice shaking slightly. "I have seen many humans in the archives. In the files you sent me. They looked at me with fear. With disgust. They tried to destroy my people." "I am sorry," Thomas said. "Some humans are like that. But not all of us. I'm not like that." Oliver extended one of its tentacles toward the glass. Thomas reached out his hand and pressed it against the transparent material. For a moment, it was as if they were touching, separated only by the barrier between their worlds. "Will you help me understand this new world?" Oliver asked. "Will you teach me?" "Yes," Thomas said. "And you will teach me. We will learn together." Over the next weeks, Thomas and Oliver began the real work of alliance. Thomas repaired the systems in the lower decks, restoring power and light and heat. Oliver, in turn, began to show Thomas the technologies of its ancient civilization. Things that human engineering had not yet discovered. Ways of thinking about physics and mathematics that opened new possibilities. Together they created something remarkable. Oliver had knowledge that had been lost for 300 years. Thomas had the practical skills to implement it. They began with small projects, repairing the ship's systems, but soon they moved on to more ambitious work. Thomas brought materials from the colony. Metal, wiring, components that could be combined in new ways. He and Oliver worked together, the human and the alien, the old engineer and the ancient creature. They built things that had never existed before. Devices that combined human ingenuity with alien technology. Tools that were more efficient, more powerful, more beautiful than anything either species could have created alone. Within 2 months, word began to spread through the colony. People came to the ship to see what was happening. They saw Thomas and Oliver working together in what had once been a salvage yard and was now becoming something like a workshop. A place of creation. A place where impossible things were being made real. Some people were afraid. Some brought weapons. But most were simply curious. Most wanted to understand what was happening here, on the edge of the colony, where an old human engineer and an alien creature were creating wonders together. Scientists began to arrive. Philosophers and artists and engineers from the other settlements on Mars. They came to study what Thomas and Oliver were doing. They came to understand how a human and an alien could work together without fear or violence. Thomas found himself becoming a teacher. He showed other humans how to look past their fear, how to see intelligence and creativity and beauty in something that was different from them. Oliver, in turn, learned what it meant to have purpose again, to contribute something meaningful to the universe instead of rotting in imprisonment. They became friends. Not just allies or collaborators but genuine friends. They shared meals together, though Oliver could not eat human food and Thomas could not eat what Oliver preferred. They sat together in the workshop they had created and simply talked, sharing stories and dreams and fears. One day, sitting together in the workshop as the sun set over the red landscape of Mars, Oliver said something that Thomas had not expected. "Thank you for seeing me as something other than a monster." Thomas smiled and patted one of Oliver's tentacles gently. "Thank you for showing me that the universe is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than I ever imagined." They sat together in the gathering darkness, the old human and the ancient alien, two survivors who had found each other in the vast emptiness of space and learned that connection and friendship were possible across any divide. The news from the Martian Colonial Authority came on a cold morning 6 months after Thomas had first opened the containment pod. An official representative arrived at the workshop with a document sealed with the government's emblem. Thomas read it carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he absorbed the words. Oliver was being granted asylum. Provisional asylum under extraordinary circumstances, the document stated. The first of its kind in human law. Oliver was no longer a prisoner. Oliver was a citizen, of sorts, protected by human law and recognized as a sentient being with rights and freedoms. Thomas showed the document to Oliver through the neural interface terminal. The creature went very still for a long time. When it finally spoke, its voice was barely above a whisper. "I am free." "Yes," Thomas said. "You are free." Oliver did not celebrate. Instead, it asked a question that would change everything once again. "Are there others like me? Other beings imprisoned by empires that no longer exist? Other survivors left alone in the darkness?" Thomas had not thought about this before. But now that Oliver had asked, he realized the answer was almost certainly yes. The galaxy was vast and old. Civilizations had risen and fallen for millions of years. How many beings might be locked away in forgotten places, abandoned by the empires that had imprisoned them? That was when Thomas made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He and Oliver began to search the archives. They looked through historical records and government databases and old scientific reports. Slowly, carefully, they found references to other imprisoned beings. Some were in sealed vaults on distant planets. Some were in ships like Oliver's drifting through space. Some were in facilities that had been forgotten for so long that no one even remembered they existed anymore. Thomas talked to the colonial authority. At first they were skeptical. One freed alien was extraordinary enough. But Thomas was persistent. He showed them the records he and Oliver had found. He explained what it would mean to leave these beings imprisoned for no reason other than inertia and fear. Gradually he won them over. The Institute for Rediscovery was established 1 year after Thomas had first discovered Oliver in the containment pod. It was funded by the Martian colonial government, but Thomas served as its director. Oliver became its chief researcher and technical specialist, using its vast knowledge of ancient technology to help locate and safely awaken other imprisoned beings. The first expedition was to a moon orbiting a gas giant 3 solar systems away. The team consisted of Thomas, Oliver, 2 human scientists named Charlotte and Robert, and a medical specialist named Helen. They traveled in a ship equipped with the technology that Thomas and Oliver had created together in their workshop. When they arrived, they found what Oliver's records had suggested. A vault built by a long-dead civilization, sealed tight and guarded by systems that had operated without interruption for over 200 years. Inside was a being very different from Oliver. It was crystalline in structure, composed of what looked like living glass, with colors that shifted and changed as it moved. The process of awakening it was delicate and careful. Thomas and Oliver worked together, using their combined knowledge to understand the alien life support systems, to restart them safely, to bring the crystalline being back to consciousness without harming it. When the creature finally woke, it was afraid and confused just as Oliver had been. But this time it did not face the fear alone. Thomas and Oliver were there to help it understand. To tell it that the universe had changed. That it was no longer imprisoned. That it was free. Over the next 2 years, Thomas and Oliver led 7 more expeditions. Each one was different. Each one presented new challenges and new dangers. Some of the beings they found were dangerous and had to be carefully contained for the safety of everyone around them. But most of them were not monsters. Most of them were simply lonely and afraid, confused about why they had been locked away and desperate for connection. The Institute for Rediscovery grew. More scientists joined the team. More funding was allocated. Other colonies on Mars and Europa and the moons of Saturn became interested in the work. Slowly, the attitude of humanity toward alien life began to change. Instead of seeing aliens as threats to be conquered or destroyed, humans began to see them as beings worthy of compassion and understanding. News of Thomas and Oliver's work spread throughout human space. Articles were written. Videos were recorded. Young people began to dream of joining the Institute and participating in the work of rediscovery and redemption. 5 years after the establishment of the Institute, Thomas stood in what had once been the workshop on the salvage ship. It was now a museum and a university combined. Thousands of people came to visit every year. They walked through the corridors where Thomas and Oliver had first met, where the first alliance between human and alien had been forged. Students from around the solar system came to study the work that Thomas and Oliver had done. They learned not just about technology and science, but about compassion and understanding. They learned that the universe was not a place of conflict and conquest, but a place where connection was possible if one was willing to take the risk. Thomas was old now. His hair was completely white. His hands were gnarled and scarred from decades of work. But he was happy in a way he had never been before. He had found purpose in retirement. He had found meaning in helping others understand that fear and prejudice were not inevitable, that there was always another way. One evening, as the sun was setting over the Martian landscape, Thomas and Oliver sat together in what had become their favorite spot in the old workshop. It was the same place where they had first talked through the neural interface, where an old engineer and an ancient alien had begun to understand each other. Oliver extended a tentacle and gently placed it on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture it had learned from watching humans interact with each other. "Thank you," Oliver said simply. "Thank you for seeing me as more than a threat. Thank you for giving me a second chance at life. Thank you for showing me that the universe still held beauty and goodness and meaning." Thomas reached up and placed his weathered hand on one of Oliver's tentacles. "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me that an old man still had something valuable to contribute to the world. Thank you for teaching me that compassion is stronger than fear. Thank you for being my friend." They sat together in the fading light, watching as ships arrived at the docking platforms. Ships bringing new refugees, new beings freed from forgotten prisons, new survivors discovering that they were no longer alone in the darkness. All of them coming to the workshop, coming to meet the human and the alien who had shown the galaxy that redemption was always possible. Thomas thought about where he had started, standing on a landing platform with nothing but time and emptiness ahead of him. Now his life was full. Now his purpose was clear. Now he understood that the greatest discoveries were not about technology or science, but about the connections between beings, about the bridges that could be built between different worlds. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas smiled. The universe was vast and strange and wonderful. And it was getting better every day, one being, one connection, one act of compassion at a time.